There is not a single one of us, Ahlul Bayt, except that they were either poisoned or killed by the sword. Now, when you reflect on this narration, what you understand is that all of the Imams, without exception, were perceived as great warriors and upholders of truth. We don't have any Imam who could be described as quietist. You know, some of us on a subconscious level, we might have this perception of some of the Imams as being politically detached. When we think of Imam Husayn alayhi salam, it's very evident that this is an Imam who displayed great courage and bravery and who was willing to sacrifice his life. And on a subconscious level, many of us may not see Imams like Imam Zainul Abideen in that same light. When I mention Zainul Abideen, some of us may immediately picture a man who is sitting in the corner of the masjid, praying, crying over what happened in Karbala, politically detached and focused only on his personal worship. You might even look at some of the later Imams in that way, that these are Imams who were under house arrest, they were reciting Quran, they were worshiping, and they were politically detached. But the fact that all of the Imams were martyred shows us that they were all part of a divine resistance that began with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and all of them, without exception, were seen by their enemies as Imams of resistance. You know, sometimes the enemies of Ahlul Bayt have a more accurate understanding of the Imams than we do. They perceive them as a threat to the power structures of the time more so than we do. We might see Zainul Abideen as a reclusive worshipper, but the Umayyads did not. The Umayyads understood that these Imams, they are always engaged in some form of resistance. Yes, the resistance may change. The method of the resistance may evolve. But they are relentlessly trying to dismantle the structures and the institutions that perpetuate injustice. Imam Zainul Abideen alayhi salam, it is very important that we see him in an accurate way. That we understand that yes, on the day of Ashura, he was sick. He was not able to participate militarily. But sometimes that episode of his life, we use it to characterize the rest of his life. Many of us may not know that on the day of Ashura, after all of the men were martyred, and Imam Husayn alayhi salam stood alone, he made what we can call his final plea. The Imam alayhi salam, as he stood there with the bodies of his family members and his companions scattered as corpses on the plains of Karbala, he called out, "Ala hal min nasirin yansuruna." Is there someone who can come to our help, come to our aid? "Ala hal min dhabbin yadhubbu an harami Rasulillah." Is there anyone who can rush to the defense of the family of the Prophet, the women folk of the prophetic household? there was no one left to respond among the men. We have a narration that says that Imam Zainul Abideen alayhi salam, he was sick in his tent and he was going in and out of consciousness. When the Imam made this call, Imam Zainul Abideen was conscious. And he turned to his aunt, Sayyidah Zainab. He heard the call of his Imam. He said, Ya ammata alayya bis-sayfi wal-asa. He says, oh my aunt Zainab, hand me my sword and my staff. Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, he could see, he could hear his son. He goes into the tent. He says to his son, Imam Zainul Abideen, وَمَا تَصْنَعُ بِهِمَا? What do you want to do with a staff and a sword? He says, أَمَّا الْعَصَى فَأَتَوَكَّأُ عَلَيْهَا. As for my staff, I'm sick and it can help me stand. وَأَمَّا السَّيْفِ فَأَذُبُّ بِهِ بَيْنَ يَدَيْ إِبْنِ بِنْتِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. As for my sword, I want my sword so I can defend the grandson of Rasulullah. فَلَا خَيْرَ فِي الْعَيْشِ بَعْدَ. Because there is no goodness in this life after him. So you see, even in that most critical moment, the Imam alayhi salam was willing to fight. He did not shy away. But this is where Imam Zainul Abideen, he said to Zainab, hold him back, O Zainab, for I fear that the progeny of the Messenger of God would cease to exist if he comes out. This was the condition of Zainul Abideen on the 10th of Muharram. When Imam Zainul Abideen alayhi salam, when he was a captive, we know about his fiery sermons. When Ibn Ziyad tried to intimidate him with death, Ibn Ziyad, when they brought the caravan to Kufa, he was doing a head count to make sure that the job was done, that everyone who was supposed to be killed was killed. Ibn Ziyad, he sees an adult male. He approaches him. He says, what's your name? He says, my name is Ali ibn al-Husayn. Ibn Ziyad, he says, didn't Allah kill Ali ibn al-Husayn? And we'll speak about this shortly. This false doctrine of fatalism that was introduced by the Umayyads. That whatever happens is God's doing. Imam Zainul Abideen, he responds to Ibn Ziyad. This Ibn Ziyad was so intimidating that even some of the warriors of Kufa would be afraid to speak in his presence. He says, Imam Sajjad says, I had an older brother. I had a brother named Ali ibn al-Husayn. He was killed by people, not God. Ibn Ziyad, he says, you dare respond to me? You have the audacity to talk back to me? He says to his men, behead him. Imam Zainul Abideen, what did he do at this moment? Did he shake and tremble with fear? He said, أَبِالْقَتْلِ تُهَدِّدُنِي يَبْنَ مَرْجَانَ. Are you trying to intimidate me with death, O son of Marjana? القتل لنا عادة وكرامتنا من الله الشهادة. To be slaughtered and killed is something that is quite normal in our family. And our honor from Allah Azza wa Jal is what? Is martyrdom. Even when Imam Sajjad is speaking face to face with martyrs, with tyrants, he's fearless. In Sham, he gave that fiery sermon. A sermon that was so powerful that Yazid decided that he did not want the family of Rasulullah to remain in Sham. Because if they remain, even Sham would become one of the strongholds of Shi'ism. So this is our Imam. an Imam of resistance, an Imam of courage, an Imam of bravery. Now the question is, when we examine the life of Imam Sajjad, how did he continue this movement of resistance? Because as we said, all of the Imams were killed because they were symbols of resistance. After the tragedy of Karbala, today when we reflect on Karbala, it's very obvious that Imam Husayn alayhi salam was victorious. When you go for Arba'een, it's obvious that Yazid, yes, he might have won the battle, but he lost the war. Today it's obvious. When you go to Karbala and you see millions of people from around the world chanting Labbayka ya Hussain, victory is obvious. But in the immediate aftermath of Ashura, it was not obvious. The Shia, the Muslim community at large, they were demoralized. Because in the immediate aftermath, what happened? Hussein and his companions were killed. The family of Rasulullah, they were taken as captives, and Yazid is still in power. So they were deflated. They were demoralized. Imam Zainul Abideen, he says, on the day of Ashura, 18 members of my family were slaughtered, the likes of which there is no equal in the ummah of Rasulullah. Meaning that those who were killed on the 10th of Muharram, they were irreplaceable people. Shaykh al-Tusi, rahmatullahi alayhi, says after Ashura, there were only 3 to 5 Shia left. They were just a handful of Shia, theological Shia. The Imam alayhi salam, he had to literally rebuild this community. The Imam alayhi salam now has to continue the resistance, but the problem is he doesn't have a base. How can you fight tyranny if you're by yourself? The Imam alayhi salam, he literally has nobody, only a handful of people. So what does he do? You see, it is not enough, and I mentioned this during Jum'ah today, it is not enough to remove an oppressor from power to bring about justice. You have to rebuild human beings. Because if you have a corrupt society, a society that cannot discern between justice and injustice, all that will happen is that you will remove one zalim, one oppressor, and it will be replaced by another oppressor. So the Imam, what does he do? After Karbala, the Imam, he invests in human capital. He begins reconstructing human beings. And he has to do it in a way that does not attract the attention of the Umayyads. Because you can imagine what life was like for Imam Zainul Abideen after Karbala. He is the most surveillanced man in the entire Islamic world. Why? Because he is the son of the man who revolted. Naturally, the government is going to keep tabs on such a person. Yazid saw what Imam Sajjad is able to do from the pulpit. So in Medina, do you think he's going to be able to give sermons? He's not going to be able to give sermons. He's going to be censored. So the Imam alayhi salam is now in a situation where he doesn't have an army to resist, and he doesn't have a pulpit to speak truth to power. Most of us would say, we'll just have to wait for the next generation to do the work. We would give up. We would feel that that's it. I have no way of resisting. But what does the Imam do? The Imam, he turns his attention to one of the most neglected segments of society. He decides to build his base. What does he do? He takes advantage of a pre-modern institution known as the institution of slavery. Slavery was common in the pre-modern era. And it was quite normal for a person to purchase slaves and sell slaves. This was not an activity that would alert the authorities. It was a part of normal life. So Imam Zainul Abideen, what he does is that he takes some of the money that he has, because he had inherited some farmlands from Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. And what he does is he starts to purchase slaves. Not because Imam Zainul Abideen was looking for cheap labor. The Imam was not looking for people who would serve him so he could live a more comfortable life. No. Society saw slaves as cheap labor. Imam Zainul Abideen did not see them in that light. He saw all of them as potential ambassadors of the resistance. He saw them as potential ambassadors of the truth. You know, sometimes even today, we need to have this Imam Zainul Abideen approach. There are some segments of society that we, the Shia community, we've completely ignored. One example is Central America and South America. This is a completely untapped population. Many of the Christians who live in Central America and South America, they are Catholic. It would be very easy to spread Shia Islam throughout Central America and South America. It's really as simple as finding some Hausa students who speak Spanish. You sponsor them. You say, go back to your home country, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Mexico. We will help you purchase a center and start with just Friday prayer. And believe me, within a generation, you will have an entire community. But we don't see the potential. Even though it's right there, Imam Zainul Abideen, he saw the potential. It is said that Imam Zainul Abideen alayhi salam, he had a habit of purchasing slaves. And by the way, slaves were not cheap. You know, buying a slave was comparable to what it would cost for a car today. It was a big investment. Imam Zainul Abideen alayhi salam, every year he would purchase slaves. What would he do? He would keep the slave for 1 year. And that slave would remain in the home of the Imam for a year. And the Imam would train the slaves for a year. He would teach them the Quran. He would teach them spirituality, ethics, Islamic law, and he would emancipate them, according to some narrations, on Eid al-Fitr or Eid al-Adha. They would spend 1 year receiving direct training from him. He would give them everything that they need, the skills that they would need to be self-sufficient, and then he would send them to the different parts of the Islamic empire. And it is said that over the span of his life, he bought and emancipated 100,000 slaves. 100,000 slaves. All trained by Imam Sajjad. And if you want to understand the quality of the people that the Imam was producing, I'll share with you the following story. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab, who was one of the tabi'een, he's very well known even in Sunni circles. He was a prominent scholar, a second generation Muslim, who had met some of the Sahaba. He says that 1 year there was a severe drought in Medina. a severe drought. And because Medina was a religious city, people had a habit that when the rain would cease to fall, collectively they would perform Salatul Istisqa. They would do this ritual called the prayer invoking rain. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib was a very pious man, a scholar in his own right. He says that for several days we would go out into the open desert and we would supplicate, but no rain would fall. He says, one day I saw a black man who was standing by himself on a nearby hill. He says, he was standing by himself, and I went, and I could hear him making a heartfelt dua. And he said, "Oh Allah, send down rain, for you know that ever since I have come to know you, I have never disobeyed you." He says, after that dua, I saw the clouds assemble. He says, it rained so much that I felt that Medina was going to get flooded. So he says, this man, his face was emanating with light. So I decided to follow him, to see who is this man. He says, I followed him and I saw that he entered the house of Ali ibn al-Husayn. He entered the house of Imam Sajjad. He says, I went to Imam Sajjad. I recognized that he was a slave. And I said to Imam Sajjad, Ya ibn Rasulullah, there is a slave that you have that I would like to purchase. This was common in the pre-modern era. So the Imam alayhi salam, he says, which slave is it? He says, I don't know his name. So the Imam asked one of the housekeepers that bring all of the servants. So all of the servants, they stand. And he's looking, trying to find the man that was standing on the hill. He says, I looked and I told the Imam that I don't see him present. Is there another slave that is missing? And the Imam says, yes, but he's an elderly man. Don't you want someone who's young, who will be able to assist you? He says, no, that is the one that I want. He was in charge of the stables. The Imam had some horses. He was in charge of the stables. The man came out, and Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, he said, the moment I saw him, I told Imam Zainul Abideen that this is the man. And I told the Imam the story, and I said to him that I want to purchase him, not so he can serve me, I want to serve him. The old man, he looked at me, and he said to me, why are you trying to separate me from my master? His eyes had filled with tears. He says that, why are you trying to separate me from Zainul Abideen? The Imam alayhi salam, he decided to gift this man to Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib. The narration says that Sa'id had made an agreement that the following day he would come to take the man. The narration says that that night, that man, he turned to Allah and he said to Allah, إن كانت سريرة ما بيني وبينك قد أذعتها علي فاقبضني إليك. The man, he said to Allah, oh Allah, if the secret has now been exposed, the secret between me and you, that I have never disobeyed you since I have come to know you, now that the secret is out, I ask you to take my soul. The following morning, Sa'id is sent a message that you are invited to attend the funeral of this man. These are the types of people that the Imam was raising. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. When we say that the Imam alayhi salam was building an army, this is what we're talking about. Imagine you have people like this who are sent to North Africa, who are sent to Egypt, who are sent to different parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Look at how fast and how quickly the teachings of Ahlul Bayt will spread. This is why there are parts of North Africa, even if they're not Shia, they have immense love for Ahlul Bayt. Why? Because if you go back generations, it was probably because of the efforts of these types of slaves that were trained by Imam Sajjad. Another story that we have about these servants, Shaykh al-Mufid in Kitab al-Irshad, he says that one day Imam Sajjad was preparing for salah. He was preparing for prayer. And one of the female servants in the home, she brought a jug of water for the Imam to perform wudu. And she was not paying attention. She clumsily dropped the jug and it fell on the face of the Imam. And it cut his face. It caused a wound. The Imam, he looked at her. And she could sense that the Imam was upset because she was being careless. She recited Surah Ali Imran, ayah 134. She could sense that the Imam was annoyed. She said, وَالْكَاظِمِينَ الْغَيْظِ. She converses with the Imam using Quran. She recites the ayah where Allah describes the virtuous people. She says, and those who restrain their anger. The Imam smiled. He said, كَظَمْتُ غَيْظِي. I have restrained my anger. She said, وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ. It's not enough for you just to not be upset with me. And those who pardon when they are wronged. The Imam said, عَفَى اللَّهُ عَنْكِ. May Allah pardon you. And then she said, وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And Allah loves the good doers. The Imam says, go, I have emancipated you. You see, in the house of Imam Zainul Abideen, he created an environment where just 1 year with Imam Zainul Abideen and you become this proficient in Quran. So the Imam alayhi salam, one phase of his resistance movement is what? Is that he's teaching. He's purchasing slaves, nurturing them, and he's emancipating them. And the Imam alayhi salam, in this way, he was able to build what we can call the army of God. Imam Zainul Abideen alayhi salam, another thing that he used to do is that in his life, and we'll speak about this more tomorrow night, he took advantage of Hajj. Hajj is the largest annual gathering of Muslims. Imam, he doesn't have a pulpit in Medina, but in Hajj, you meet Muslims from all around the Islamic empire. During Tawaf, he's able to have conversations. In Mina, he can have conversations. So every year he would go to Hajj and people would talk to him. They'd ask him questions. He would give people guidance. In fact, many of the ahadith that we have from Imam Zainul Abideen were communicated to the Muslims during Hajj. So you see that the Imam alayhi salam, he takes advantage of the platforms that are available to him. You see, the Imam, he's teaching us that if one form of media is censored, you have to find alternative forms of media. And this is something that we have to learn. I always tell young people who are in high school, in university, that alhamdulillah, we live in a time where people, they've lost faith in the legacy media. You, with your own YouTube channel, with your own TikTok videos, you can be the alternative media. As the United States and Israel try to censor and try to dominate the narrative, as they try to shape their narrative, you can present the opposing narrative. You can provide a counter narrative. So Imam Zainul Abideen alayhi salam, he teaches us the art of adaptation. We have to learn to adapt. We should not become despondent when one platform is removed. We have to be creative. So the Imam alayhi salam, he does this in the holy city of Mecca. Now the Imam alayhi salam, in Medina, there was a type of media, that we can call it, that the Imam was able to engage in. You see, the Imam was wise. The Imam, as he's building this resistance, he's doing it in a way that is not going to put his life in danger and the life of his followers in danger. You see, sometimes we as Shias, we become a little bit too reckless. And we act as though recklessness is courage. Maybe some of us during the time of Imam Sajjad, we would want the Imam to come out in the middle of the street and condemn the Umayyads explicitly. The Imam did not do that. The Imam, he kept a low profile. Keeping a low profile doesn't mean that you're a coward. It means that you're strategic. The Imam alayhi salam was able to counter the false narratives in a way that did not endanger himself and the Shia. You see, my dear brothers and sisters, our Imams, they teach us this principle of taqiyya. At-taqiyyatu dini wa dinu abai. We should not think that our lives are so cheap that we're constantly putting our lives at risk. Imam Husayn, he put his life at risk because there was a great benefit that could be achieved. Do not put yourself in danger if it's not going to generate any real benefit. So the Imam alayhi salam, he exercises this caution. He is strategic in his movement. And we have to learn from this. Sometimes we are and sometimes because we're so passionate, we expect even our maraji' to just abandon all precaution and just say whatever they want. And we might think that, how come Sayyid Fulan and Shaykh Fulan is not coming out and declaring jihad against this group or that group? Because the maraji' are following the way of the Imams. You know, many of us, we have this slogan where we say that we want to live like Ali and die like Hussain. Some of us, we have an inaccurate understanding of this. If someone wants to die like Zainul Abideen, is it a problem? If someone wants to live like Imam al-Baqir and die like Ja'far al-Sadiq, is there anything wrong with that? There is a statement, a quote that many of us have memorized, but there are two issues with this quotation. And it's a quotation from the late Imam Khomeini rahmatullahi alayh. He said, every day is Ashura and every land is Karbala. There are two problems with this statement. It's not that Imam al-Khomeini knew what he intended, but you and I, we fall into two errors when it comes to this quotation. Number one, many of us unknowingly have attributed this statement to the Imams. I remember growing up, I used to think that this was a hadith from Imam Sadiq, because many people, they unknowingly attribute it to the Imam. So number one, this is not a hadith. Number two, we have to have a correct understanding of the statement. Imam Khomeini, when he said every day is Ashura, and every land is Karbala, the meaning of this is not that in every era we have to assume the same form of resistance as Imam al-Husayn. That is not the correct understanding. Because even the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, their resistance against dhulm, it changed depending on the changing circumstances. What it does mean is that in every day and in every land we can draw inspiration from Imam al-Husayn. This is a correct understanding. But we should not say that in every era we have to engage in a military conflict just like Imam al-Husayn. No, this is actually very destructive. You can actually endanger the Shia if you try to propagate such a message, because this is not the sunnah of the other Imams. The Imams, they would always read the political climate in an accurate way. They would accurately assess the political conditions, and they would organize a resistance based on what was in the best interest of the Shia at the time. So Imam Zainul Abideen in Medina, he has to now confront some of these false theological beliefs that are being peddled by the Umayyads. You see, corrupt governments, when they come to power, they often try to invoke religious traditions. They use ulama to justify and to legitimize their power. So one of the beliefs that came into existence during the time of the Umayyads is this idea that if someone is in power, God put them in power. And they would reference an ayah of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Ali Imran, Surah 3, ayah 26. قُلِ اللَّهُمَّ مَالِكَ الْمُلْكِ تُؤْتِ الْمُلْكَ مَنْ تَشَاءُ وَتَنْزِعُ الْمُلْكَ مِمَّنْ تَشَاءُ. The Quran says Allah is the one who gives power, and Allah is the one who takes it away. So the Umayyads, what would they do? They had their court scholars, they had their puppet ulama, who would convey this idea to the masses that, hey, do not rebel against the ruler, because if you rebel against the ruler, you are rebelling against the decree of God. And this ideology exists until today. Many Muslims, they have this idea that it is a bid'ah, it is haram to rebel against a Muslim ruler, even if they're corrupt. Just make dua in the masjid, give them private advice as if you have access to the sultan. You go give them private advice, right? Because that always goes well. So you had these false ideas. Among the false doctrines that were spread by the Umayyads was what? This idea of fatalism, predestination. That whatever happens is the work of God. That's why Ibn Ziyad, what did he say to Imam Zainul Abideen? Didn't Allah kill Ali ibn al-Husayn? And this is where the Imam responded. He said, no, people killed Ali ibn al-Husayn. If you look at the du'as in Sahih al-Sajjadiyya, you find that Imam Sajjad is often correcting the aqa'id of the people. He's correcting misunderstandings that people have about the conception of God, because there was a tendency among people to anthropomorphize God. The Imam alayhi salam in Risalat al-Huquq, he speaks about the right of the sultan. For example, if you look at what he says فَأَمَّا حَقُّ السُّلْطَانِ, because many of these rulers, they saw their authority as a privilege. They would loot the public treasury, the cousin and the nephew, all of them would come to power. Most of these governments were nepotistic. So Imam Sajjad in Risalatul Huquq, what does he say? فَأَمَّا حَقُّ السُّلْطَانِ فَأَن تَعْلَمَ أَنَّكَ جُعِلْتَ لَهُ فِتْنَةً وَأَنَّهُ مُبْتَلَى فِيكَ. The Imam says that the right of the ruler is for you to know that he is a test for you and you are a test for him. If you are a subject, you have a responsibility to hold that ruler accountable. The Sultan is not free to do whatever he wants. Allah is testing the ruler through the subjects. So you see the Imam alayhi salam, he redefined authority as a responsibility and not a matter of entitlement. Because nepotism was rampant among the Umayyads. And this is why, if you look at the narrations, you find that one year Imam Zainul Abideen, when he was in Hajj, Tawus al-Yamani, who was one of the Tabi'een, he says, I was performing Hajj one year and Imam Zainul Abideen was present. And he said, and this is mentioned by Allam al-Majlisi in Bihar al-Anwar, he says that I observed Imam Sajjad and he was doing mustahab tawaf from the time after Salatul Isha until the late hours of the night. He was doing continuous tawaf until the haram became empty. Gradually people left and they went to sleep. Until it was just me and Zainul Abideen inside of Masjid al-Haram. He says, I was standing far away, and when the Imam saw that he was alone, he raised his face to the sky. And he started to speak to Allah in a very beautiful way, beautiful munajat. He would say, Ilahi gharat nujumu samawatik, وهجعت عيون أنامك. Oh Allah, the stars of your sky have set, and the eyes of your creation have closed for rest. وأبوابك مفتحات للسائلين. The kings have closed their gates, but your gate remains open. And then he would say, as he's supplicating, he says, Ilahi, oh Allah, forgive me, pardon me, show me mercy. Tawus, he says that Imam Zainul Abideen, he began to cry. He was begging Allah for his mercy, for his maghfirah. He says, I was listening to these words and I went to the Imam. And I said to the Imam, I wanted to speak to the Imam, and the Imam was immersed in dua. And he looked at me and he says, Man hadha alladhi ashghalani an dhikri Rabbi? Who is this person who is distracting me from my Lord? I said to the Imam, Ya ibn Rasulullah, if you are supplicating like this, what should we say? Your father is Imam al-Husayn. Your grandfather is Amir al-Mu'mineen. You're the grandson of the Prophet. You are safe. You have nothing to fear. You are protected on the Day of Judgment. Why is it that you cry so intensely? The Imam alayhi salam, he says to him, he says to Tawus that, O Tawus, da'ni an hadith Abi wa ummi wa jaddi. The Imam is teaching that nepotism has no place in Islam. Your standing before Allah has nothing to do with who you're related to. He says, don't talk to me about who my father is, who my mother is, who my ancestors are. خلق الله الجنة لمن أطاعه وأحسن ولو كان عبدا حبشيا. O Tawus, know that Allah has created paradise for His obedient and righteous servant, even if he is a slave from Ethiopia. Because Ethiopian slaves at that time, they were seen as the lowest class of people, the slave class. The Imam says, if someone is obedient, Jannah is for these people. وَخَلَقَ النَّارَ لِمَنْ عَصَاهُ وَلَوْ كَانَ وَلَدًا قُرَشِيًّا. And Allah has created the hellfire for a youth of Quraysh, even if he's from the same tribe of the Prophet. If he's disobedient, his relationship to the Prophet is not going to help him, is not going to benefit him. Imam Zainul Abideen alayhi salam, he took advantage of these platforms. Through these du'as, the Imam, he was educating the people, he was teaching the people. And the Imam was also exposing the crimes of Bani Umayyah. You may say, how? You know, sometimes a single deed can achieve multiple goals. You know, sometimes as youth, we think that we're helpless. You might think that there's only one thing that I can do, but we don't realize that one action can have a ripple effect. Imam Zainul Abideen, do you know what he used to do? It is said that when he died, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he was washing his body. And some of the family members, some of the companions, when they were preparing to wrap him in his shroud, there were marks on his shoulder. So they asked the Imam, Ya ibn Rasulullah, this is your father. Did your father have an ailment? Because what are these bruises and these marks on his shoulder and on his back? Imam al-Baqir, he says that is from the sacks of food that he would carry at night. Every night, he would go and he would distribute food to the poor. You know, Imam Sajjad had such prestige that he could have asked someone else to do the manual labor. He could have gathered the funds and say, Fulan, he could have told one of his slaves that you guys go and distribute food to the poor. But the Imam, he used to do it himself. And this is something that we should also do. I know many of us were generous. We donate. But there's a big difference between hitting a button on your phone and going and putting in the work and delivering aid to the needy. It's a humbling experience. The Imam, he would go door to door. And you know what he used to do? He used to go late at night when there was no audience. Because for Imam Sajjad, charity is not PR. Politicians today, they have to have the money shot. They have to have footage of all of the good things that they do. Imam Zainul Abideen at night, he's distributing food to the poor. And he's covering his face. Why? Because number one, he's only seeking God's pleasure. He's not doing it so people can say, look at how generous Zainul Abideen is. But he's also doing this to protect the dignity of the families who are receiving the aid. Because what is the use of giving charity if you are humiliating the recipient? And by doing this, Imam Sajjad, because people eventually came to know that it was him. And they came to know that it was him on the day that he died, because that's when the aid stopped. And by doing this, the Imam was doing something that was unprecedented. The Imam had established a social welfare system, because in the past, if a beggar wanted help, they would have to go into the streets. They would have to go and extend their hands. If you wanted any aid from the Umayyads, you would have to flatter them. That's why one of the ways, if you wanted money from the government, either you had to work for them or you would have to become a poet who praises them. And they would give you gifts. You would basically have to sell out to receive aid. So the Imam, he took it upon himself. He filled that gap. And by doing that, naturally people are going to ask what? Why are there so many poor people in Medina? And people start connecting the dots. It's because the government is not giving people their due right. Why is an average citizen managing a social welfare system? Because the Umayyads are corrupt. You see, the Imam doesn't have to shout in the streets, down with the Umayyads. No, he doesn't have to do that. He does something more wise, more effective. He helps the people and he allows them to recognize the corruption of the Umayyads on their own. This was the genius of Imam Sajjad. And the Umayyads, their nightmare was for the story of Karbala to remain alive. But of course, the Umayyads cannot prevent a man from crying over his family. They cannot ban crying. And that's why whenever Imam Sajjad, whenever there was an opportunity to mention Karbala, he took advantage. These majalis, they are the inheritance from Imam Zainul Abideen. If it wasn't for his efforts during those 34 years after Karbala, the story of Imam Husayn would have never reached us. Look at what we inherited from Ahlul Bayt. Is there any religious tradition in the world that has produced a mass education initiative like the Shia of Ahlul Bayt? Where 10 days out of the year, even the people who are furthest from the religion, they will come sit under the pulpit of Imam al-Husayn. If you want to organize any other educational program, you have to market, you have to spend money. But with Imam al-Husayn's majlis, you don't have to market. People call you and they ask you, when is the majlis? This is because of the resistance of Imam Sajjad. It is said that whenever a cup of water was given to Imam Zainul Abideen, whenever water would be brought to him, they say that he would mix his tears with the water. The eye drops, the tear drops would drip into his water from how much he would cry. Abu Hamza al-Thumali was one of the students of Imam Sajjad. And one day he said to Imam Sajjad, when he saw him in that condition, he said to him, Ya ibn Rasulullah, al-qatlu lakum aada wa karamatukum min Allah al-shahada. That Karbala was many years ago, and you are still crying so bitterly. Why are you still weeping? Why are you still mourning? Your father is in the highest levels of Jannah, but isn't it time to move on? Isn't it time to move on? Imam Zainul Abideen, he would say that to his companions, that, can you blame me for crying? When Ya'qub was separated from Yusuf, he cried until he became blind. And Yusuf was sitting in a palace in Egypt. But being separated from Yusuf was enough to cause Ya'qub anguish. O my companions, was Yusuf's head separated from his body? Was Yusuf trampled by the horses? I lost 18 members of my family, and their heads were put on spears. Imam Zainul Abideen, when they would say to him, but being killed is common in your household, and Allah has honored your ancestors with martyrdom, so why does this tragedy strike a chord with you? The Imam says, Na'am ya Aba Hamza, shakar Allahu sa'yak, al-qatlu lana 'ada وكرامتنا من الله الشهادة ولكن أسألك بالله يا أبا حمزة هل سبي النساء لنا عادة. But is it also common, O Abu Hamza, is it common in our household that our women are taken as captives? They say that after the tragedy of Karbala, Umar ibn Sa'ad wants to mobilize the caravan so they can move towards Kufa. Umar ibn Sa'ad, he gathers some camels that did not have any saddles. And he tells his men, help the women get on the camels. Zainab alayhi salam, she looked at Umar ibn Sa'ad. She said, do you have no shame? You're going to let these strange men touch the daughters of Rasulullah? She said, tell them to go away. They are not to touch the daughters of Rasulullah. I will help them get on the camels. Zainab alayhi salam, she helps the women and the children mount the unsaddled camels until there are only two who are standing. Zainul Abideen and Zainab. There is a narration that says Zainab, she looks from right to left. Imam Zainul Abideen, he could sense that Zainab was looking for someone. He says to her, Ya Ammata, who are you looking for? She says to him, oh my nephew, where is the grave of Abbas? She starts to complain to her brother Abbas. أخي أنت الذي أخرجتني من منزلي. Oh Abbas, you are the one who took me out of my home in Medina. When Zainab alayhi salam, when she walked out of her house in Medina, Imam al-Husayn, he asked the men of Bani Hashim to form a human corridor for Zainab to walk so that no strange man would glance at her. When she approached her camel in Medina, her brother Abbas got down on one knee and she used the knee of Abbas to get on the camel. Now she's saying to Abbas, Ya Abbas, you are the one who brought me to Karbala. You are the one who dismounted me from my camel. Who is there to help me mount my camel? The caravan, they travel back to Kufa. They go to Kufa. There is a narration that says that the bodies of the shuhada, they remained unburied. For 3 days they were scattered. Banu Asad, one of the tribes that were living near Karbala, they came to the land of Karbala and they saw headless bodies. And they knew that it was their Islamic duty to bury these bodies. And they knew that Hussain was among them. But they were looking at each other and they were not able to identify the bodies. I say to Banu Asad, I do not blame you for not being able to recognize the bodies, for the bodies did not have any heads. But even more than that, how can you even recognize the body of Hussain when his body was crushed by the hooves of the horse? as they are trying to figure out the identity of the bodies, they see a man approaching from the direction of Kufa. They go to him and they recognize that it is Ali ibn al-Husayn, Zainul Abideen. The Imam, he comes to them, and one by one he gives them the identity of the shuhada. He says, this is the body of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. This is the body of Habib. This is Burair. This is Muslim. Until he comes to the body of Imam al-Husayn. Banu Asad, they say, Ibn Rasulullah, let us help you lift the body of your father. They say that before Imam Sajjad lifted his body, he went down to kiss the body of his father. He wanted to put his cheek on the cheek of his father. You remember what Imam al-Husayn did to Ali al-Akbar. But there was no head for the Imam to place his cheek on. So they say that Imam Sajjad, he put his cheek on the remaining throat of Aba Abdullah. And he said, على الدنيا بعدك العفايا. As he lifted the body of his father, Banu Asad, they said, let us assist you, O Imam. The Imam says, I don't need any assistance. قال إن معي من يعينني. The angels of Allah, they will help me lift the body of Aba Abdullah. He buries Imam al-Husayn. He lowers him into the grave. And you can imagine how difficult it was for Imam Sajjad to cover the body of Imam al-Husayn with dust. After he buried the body of Imam al-Husayn, there was nothing there that could indicate that this is the grave of Hussein. So they say that he took his finger and he wrote a message on the plains of Karbala. What was the message that he wrote? The only sign that he could write was a message that he wrote with his finger on the sands of Karbala. What did he write? كتب هذا قبر الحسين الذي قتلوه عطشانا غريبا. This is the grave of Hussain, the one who was slaughtered thirsty and a stranger in Karbala. He buries Imam al-Husayn. He buries Ali al-Akbar at the feet of his father. He buries Abdullah al-Radi' near the chest of his father. The shuhada are buried together. Banu Asad, they say, Ibn Rasulullah, there is one more body. We found a body that has no arms. We found the body near Shatt al-Furat. They say that Imam Zainul Abideen, when he walked towards the Euphrates, he threw himself on the body of his uncle and he cried out, Assalamu alayka ya qamar al-ashira. على الدنيا بعدك العفا يا قمر بني هاشم. Imam Zainul Abideen, he complains, he says, oh my uncle Abbas, if only you could see what they have done to the women and the children. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.